Greetings and blessings, everyone. Welcome to a review of Larry W. Hurtado's book, Destroyer of the Gods: Early Christian Distinctiveness in the Roman World. This review will focus on Chapter 4, entitled A Bookish Religion. My name is Scott Fable, and I will be your presenter. For this presentation, we will focus on the following topics. First, I'll provide you with a quick introduction to Hurtado's book and to this chapter. Second, a short summary of the chapter will be offered. Next, the strengths of the chapter will be examined. This will be followed by the chapter's weaknesses. Then, the value that the chapter has for our understanding of the New Testament and early Christianity will be described. The presentation will wrap up with a brief conclusion. So let's get started. It is quite difficult to review only a single chapter in a book without a better understanding of how that chapter fits into the larger picture. As such, why don't we take a look at the overall aim of this book? Hurtado states that his aim is highlighting some features of early Christianity that made it distinctive, even odd, in the cultural environment of the first 3 centuries AD. One of those odd features, covered in Chapter 4, is the use of books by early Christians. Let's consider the aim of this chapter. Again, Hurtado writes, reading, writing, copying, and dissemination of texts had a major place, indeed a prominence, in early Christianity that, except for ancient Jewish circles, was unusual for religious groups of the Roman era. So immediately, this can be recognized as a clear distinctiveness, or oddity, in early Christianity. Why don't we go ahead and summarize the chapter in order to address why that is the case. The 4th chapter focuses on how Christianity is a bookish religion. The author describes how reading scripture was a common part of worship, and he even cites the Apostle Paul's 2nd letter to Timothy, in which he wrote, "Until I get there, focus on reading the scriptures to the church, encouraging the believers and teaching them." Moreover, from a Christian practice, also reflecting practice in synagogue, these writings were to be read aloud, which was quite different from other Roman era practices. Another difference between early Christians and other Roman era practices that the author notes is reflected in just the sheer volume of writing that was being done at that time. Not only was there a lot of it, but it was also often much, much longer than other writings. Hurtado specifically notes how Paul's shortest letter, Philemon, is longer than the average Greco-Roman era letter. As such, the time and the effort involved in this writing was significant, and this was made especially more complex by the need to make copies of the writings in order for them to be circulated among the growing number of Christian groups. And as you can see on the slide, there was not a U.S. Postal Service around at that time, so much of the distribution was done at the personal cost to those doing the writing. However, it was absolutely worth it for the networking that was provided for these Christian groups. Finally, there was one other distinction that the author notes in this chapter. Unlike much of the writing that is now referred to as the Old Testament, the writings of early Christians, which would make up what is now referred to as the New Testament, was not written on scrolls, but in a codex. A codex is the ancestor of the modern leaf book, and an example of a codex can actually be seen on this slide. Early Christians preferred the use of the codex over scrolls, especially those that they most highly valued, that they treated as scriptures. Hurtado includes in this topic a fascinating overview about the nomina sacra as well, which is a unique way in which some scribes would abbreviate certain words when copying Christian scriptural texts. The chapter concludes with a brief summary. Within this book, chapter 4 has many strengths. First, I would say that chapter 4 is a bit of a masterpiece in writing. It's clear that the author spent a lot of time writing this chapter. One of the things that Hurtado wrote was the subsequent place of books, especially scriptures in Christian tradition down the centuries, is well known. And the biblical texts continue to have a special place in personal piety, in Christian theological reasoning, and in traditional liturgy to the present day. And this is such a beautifully constructed sentence. It also provides a wonderful introduction to the remainder of the chapter. Second, the detail subsequently provided by the author is succinct, but it conveys a wealth of content. And this is especially true in Hurtado's description of the early Christian preference for the Codex. Remarkably, there are not many weaknesses in Hurtado's book. However, this chapter has, in a way, its own weakness. In the preface to the book, the author provides a bit of history about how this book came into existence. Its first 4 chapters were presented as part of a lecture, after which this chapter, chapter 4 alone, became part of another lecture at 2 separate universities. And that is the weakness. While the first 3 chapters work really well together and seem rather balanced, there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect with the depth of discussion in chapter 4. It seems as if there was more done for this chapter than there was for the first 3. Now, on its own, this is not a bad thing. One of the things I noted earlier was the additional information about the nomina sacra, which was absolutely fascinating. However, it did seem a bit out of place. The author himself refers to it as another striking feature of early Christian manuscripts. Now, if the book had been focused on manuscripts, well, this section would have followed more naturally. However, it seems as if it were added to provide more substance to the university lectures. So, what does a modern Christian take away from this book, specifically from this chapter? Well, I would say that there are 3 key takeaways that should be noted. First, these early writings were meant to be read, indeed, they were meant to be read aloud to others, and in their entirety. Too often, a person will take a single passage or 2 out of context of the larger writing, and this was not the intention of the original text. Second, even beyond the texts of the New Testament, there were many, many other writings from this time. For example, there is the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Mary, and while it is difficult to imagine reading every single one of them, they may offer additional insight into the earliest days of the spread of Christianity. Finally, Hurtado provides many great examples of how Christianity was able to grow through the dissemination of these texts. And this should be a reminder to modern Christians that we are also called to spread the gospel to others. The Great Commission, likely not referred to as such at that time, was being actively done by early Christians, and we should do likewise. In conclusion, Hurtado does a really great job demonstrating that the young Christian movement was text-oriented. It was one of its key distinctions from other Roman-era practices. The texts were abundant, even though it was resource-intensive to write, copy, and distribute them. Based on Hurtado's work, it is clear that Christianity is truly a bookish religion. Thank you so much for your time. I wish you all blessings on all of your future endeavors.